Okay, we'll begin. Vino Adonai Eloheinu aleinu ma'aseh adenu ko'onenu aleinu ma'aseh adenu ko'onenu. I'd like to be restarting the shiur in Perashat Hashavua. Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's help, we will be giving the shiur every Sunday night at 8 o'clock. If anybody everybody received the link. If anybody didn't receive the link, please either text me either by WhatsApp or by Telegram or send me an email, and I'd be more than happy to share the links with you for this ongoing shiur on Perashat Hashavua. So we're going to be discussing Perashat Shemot, which is the first section of the book of Exodus. And of course, we have to look at the end of Breshit to understand where Shemot is coming from. And of course, at the end of Breshit, of course, we have this entire book of Breshit discusses the formation of the nation of Israel, or at least the forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the four mothers, and the sons of Yaakov, including Yosef and all the other boys, and of course the women as well. And it's basically the formation of the nation. That is basically Breshit. And then from Shemot, Parashat Shemot, from the Exodus and on to the end of the Torah, is basically the ma'asim, the actions of this nation after it's already been formed. It's very important to recognize that it says, the same way that we left Egypt with the same actions that we left Egypt is the same way we're going to leave the future exile. Part of the reason why we review the parasha every single week, we learn the Torah every single week, the section, is we want to be reminded over and over again of what it's going to look like in the future, because the same things that happened to our forefathers when they left Egypt is the same thing that's going to happen to us in the final redemption, which God willing is really, really soon. And we want to look to the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the Exodus and begin to understand what is the Exodus from America going to look like? What is the Exodus from the Western world? What is the Exodus that's in the final days of the redemption, which are upon us? What is that going to look like? And it's very important to recognize that in Masechet Sotah, it says, Bizchut nashim tzadkaniot nig'alu. In the merit of righteous women, we were redeemed. And added to that, the Arizal says, Ubizchut nashim tzadkaniot atidin lehigael. And in the merit of righteous women, we are going to be redeemed in the future. So it's very important for us to begin to understand, what is the Torah telling us? What was it about the Exodus from Egypt, and what merit did we leave? In one place in the Talmud it says that we left because of the forefathers, bizchut avot, in the merit of the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Through their deeds, through their actions, through their devotion, their faith, all the promises that God made to them, and many of them did not come true in their lifetime because those promises were made to them for their children, yet they walked straight in the path of God throughout their entire lives. Now, when we say bizchut avot, I don't think that they're meaning excluding the women, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, the mothers, the matriarchs of our nation. Because as we read through the book of Breshit, we see that the mothers, the ladies, they are not subtle. Sarah interacts with her husband in a very significant way in multiple times. Rebecca, Rivka, interacts with Yitzchak to make sure that Esav is not the one that gets the Bechorah. He's the one that doesn't get the blessing. So we understand that Rachel and Leah, we understand that these are very strong personalities. So when we say in the merit of our forefathers, we were redeemed from Egypt, I think we can include in that the four mothers. So when it says in the merit of righteous women we were redeemed from Egypt, it's not discussing the women that were in Breshit, in this Genesis story in Breshit. It's actually discussing the women that we're going to see in the parasha that we read this past Shabbat. Now, what is this zuchut? What made these women righteous? So if we look at the end of Breshit, we're very, very clear. Before Jacob dies, he specifically instructs his son, Joseph, and makes him swear that he's going to bury him in the land of Israel, with the understanding that despite the fact that Jacob came for a short period of time, 17 years, to live in the land of Egypt because of the famine that existed in the land of Canaan, based on the word that he received from God telling him to go down to Egypt. Nevertheless, Egypt was not the final destination. Unfortunately, in Jacob's situation, he died in Egypt and then was brought, as his body was brought, as we see in the end of Sefer Breshit, his body is brought to Canaan to be buried in the Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron, where all the other forefathers were buried, and Sarah and Rebekah and Leah were buried. So this is Yaakov's final instruction to his children. After he gives them the Musar, he tells them he wants to be buried in the land of Israel, for them to recognize something very clear, that the goal of the exile is not the exile. The goal of the exile is the redemption, is returning back to the land of Canaan. In Yaakov's situation, he asks his children to bring him back after he dies, to bring him back to the land and bury him in the Marat HaMachpelah. But regarding Yosef, before Yosef dies, he gives them similar instructions. However, Yosef was unable to be requested to be buried in the land of Canaan because perhaps there's various political situations going on in Egypt at that time. But he specifically makes because Yosef was the first one of the brothers to die, despite the fact that he was the younger one. But nevertheless, he makes them swear that that when they leave Egypt, that they're going to bring his bones, they're going to bring him when they leave Egypt and go back to the land of Israel. So we see the clear message in the book of Genesis, certainly towards the end, by Yaakov and Yosef, is that Egypt is not a permanent place. Egypt is a temporary place where they're going to spend some time based on the promise or based on the punishment, depending on how you look at it, of why they had to go to Egypt, because they sold their brother into slavery. But nevertheless, we see that what's going to happen is they have to remember and not lose sight of the end game. The end game is not Egypt. The end game, of course, is returning to the land of Israel. It's almost like if a person wants to run a marathon. If you don't have that 26-mile mark in your head, you're not going to finish that marathon. And it's very important not to lose the goal. As human beings, we live our lives by setting goals for ourselves. Hopefully, we set ourselves attainable goals. And then when we attain those goals, we then start new goals to go to higher, to go to different levels. A person finishes high school, their goal is to get to college. They go to college, and their goal is to go to medical school or to law school or whatever it might be. A person is always having goals in life that they set themselves forward for. We achieve the goal and then we move on, but we have to always remember not to lose sight of the end game. So we see in the end of Breshit, it's very, very clear. The end game is that they're going to go back to the land of Israel, Canaan or Israel. They're going to go back there once the redemption happens. Now we open up in Sefer Shemot. In the beginning of Sefer Shemot, it once again repeats the names of the sons of Yaakov, again, making the connection between Breshit and between Shemot. And that's why the book of Exodus begins with the letter Vav, which is a connector. A Vav is a connector. It means and. Ve'ele Shemot b'nei Israel. And these are the names of the children of Israel, showing that there's a direct connection between the actions of the fathers that happened that are discussed in Genesis and Breshit, which the actions of the children that are going to be read out in the next 4 books of the Torah. After it finishes listing all of the sons, it mentions that Joseph died, and all of that generation died. That was the final generation that had experienced directly with Yaakov, that had lived in the land of Canaan, and now had moved to the land of Egypt. The Pasuk then says in chapter 1, verse number 7, Ubnei Yisrael paru vayishretzu vayirbu vayatzbu me'od me'od vatimaleh haaretz otam. And the children of Israel, they greatly multiplied. If you look in this verse, there are 6 different verbs, and our rabbis tell us that with each pregnancy, a woman gave birth to 6 children, because they came down to Egypt with 70 individuals, as the Torah says in a number of places. They came down with 70, and then when they left Egypt, if you remember the counting, there was 604,000 men. So if you include the women and the children, you can imagine there were about 3 million people that left Egypt. The span of time between when they went down to Egypt and when they left Egypt was 210 years, which is about 3 generations, maybe 4, depending on the size of a generation. So you can imagine, how do you go from 70 individuals to 3 million? This is precisely how, and our rabbis tell us, with each pregnancy, there were 6 babies that were born. And that created some concern for the Egyptians politically, because here we have these people that are multiplying to such a level, and there was a concern, as the Pasuk says, that maybe they would join the enemy. But the beginning says in Pasuk Chet, in verse number 8, Vayakom melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. And a new king came over Egypt that didn't know Joseph. Now, we can ask lots of questions. Our rabbis ask questions about this. How is it possible that there is a king of Egypt that didn't know Joseph? If we understand at the end of book of Bereshit, if we understand over there, Joseph is the one who solidified Paro's power. Before Joseph was appointed the viceroy, the second in command, there were a bunch of noblemen who had lots and lots of land, and Paro was sort of like a figurehead. He was a puppet king. He really wasn't in charge to that level. But with the famine, Joseph, what he did is he caused them to sell their fields, and then they sold themselves, the Egyptians. And then what happens is it consolidated all the power of Egypt into Paro's hands. So Yosef is the one who made Paro into a melech. The name Paro is basically is a title for the leader, but what made him a melech precisely was Yosef. Through Yosef selling all of the food to them, and they sold their land, and then they sold their bodies. So how can it be that the king of Egypt forgot about Joseph? So some want to say it was a new king, as it says, which means it was his father died and the new king took over. But how could it be that a son wouldn't be recognizing what put his father into a position of power? Not to mention, if you look in Egypt, they were very, very clear, like many nations are, that they keep track of their history. In many of the hieroglyphics that we see, it's talking about the history of the Egyptian nation. This would be an important part of their history of how Paro became in charge of all of Egypt. How can it be that they forgot? So Rashi says there was the same king, but there were new decrees made. And because there were new decrees made, this is what brought the trouble. Now, why does the Torah tell us that the king of Egypt forgot about Yosef? And I'm going to suggest to you the reason why the king of Egypt forgot about Joseph is because the Jewish people forgot about Joseph. Well, what does that mean? They didn't forget about Joseph. They forgot the message. As we discussed in the class last week, they started to attach themselves to the culture of Egypt. This was the most popular culture in the ancient world. And when the Jewish people went there, despite the fact that they didn't change their dress, they didn't change their language, and they didn't intermarry, nevertheless, they culturally became assimilated with Egyptian culture. And what the danger, of course, that is, a person sure can listen to classical music and appreciate wonderful cultures they're surrounded by, but that's under one assumption. And that assumption is that the person doesn't forget the end game. The end game is not staying in Egypt. The end game is returning back to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, with the redemption. Joseph specifically told them to remember to bring my bones up when God redeems you. Unfortunately, what happened is the Jewish people became so engrossed in the culture of Egypt that they forgot that there was going to be redemption, or they lost emunah, they lost the faith that there was going to be redemption. So because the Jewish people forgot about Joseph in this way, despite the fact that he reminded them before he died, therefore the king of Egypt, Paro, also forgot about Yosef. And what brought about the troubles to the Jewish people in the land of Egypt was the fact that they forgot this. We know that Abraham was told that his children would be slaves in a land that wasn't theirs, so the slavery was to be expected. But the fact that they were killing their children, the fact that all the other things that we read about, the viciousness of the slavery that existed, the extra that was added on was because the Jewish people forgot about the redemption. And that's a very, very important message throughout all of our history. If you look in various times throughout our history, Baruch Hashem, we've had a very, very long history, but we've had some difficulties. In Spain, in the 1300s and 1400s, what was called the Golden Age of Spain, the Jewish people participated in the Spanish culture to a significant way. They became members of the government. As we know, the Abarbanel was the treasurer for Queen Isabella, Yemach Shema. So the Jewish people became connected to the culture, and with, of course, the exception of the Abarbanel and others, many of them started to think to themselves, this is the final stop. This is the place. And of course, when that happens, the intermarriage rate goes up. God wants us to remember that no matter where we are outside the land of Israel before the redemption, we're not to lose sight of the fact that we're going to return back to the land of Israel in the time of the Mashiach. When we begin to forget that, that's when the trouble begins. And that's why in 1492, Queen Isabella Yemach Shema, she made a decree that every Jew had to leave the land of Spain, this place that they had spent 300 years and thought they were going to stay forever. What ended up happening is they had to leave. The ones that stayed were the ones who were willing to convert and become Christian, and they hid their Jewishness. They were Jewish on the inside of the house, but on the outside they were Christian. And then what happened was the Inquisition was started to root out these new Christians that were sort of faking it because inside their houses they were Jews. And that was all the trouble, and then it extended to Portugal, and we know that history. So that's one lesson. We can also look at that in the Ashkenaz world and see a similar pattern. If you look before World War II, Poland was the major place where Jewish people were living. They had been living there for 300, 400 years. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't good. But overall, there was tremendous Torah, there was learning, there was all kinds of success the Jewish people had in Poland. But with that, of course, came intermarriage and assimilation. The word Polin in Hebrew, it's called Poland. In Hebrew it says Polin, is a play on words. Polin in Hebrew means here we will stay. And people began to say, we don't need Jerusalem. Warsaw is good enough. Warsaw, of course, the capital of Poland. This is where we need to stay. This is the end game. So, of course, the playbook is the same, just like we see in Egypt. When we think like that and we start to lose sight of the prize, that's when things become very, very difficult for us. And then, of course, now many of the Jews already left Poland because of what happened over there, and now, Baruch Hashem, they're in Israel and America. We cannot forget that here, because if we learn from history for one reason, we learn from history so we don't repeat it. The bottom line is history does repeat itself. There's no question about it. There's a pattern to history, and that's because God runs the world, and history is run by God overall. So therefore, there's this pattern that we see. The goal of learning from history is not to repeat it. And in America, we see what's going on. People are assimilating. There's all kinds of Jews that have forgotten their place. They've forgotten the goal. They've forgotten their end game. If you go to synagogues, for instance, in certain places, they're not called synagogues. They're called temples. And the reason they're called temples is because they don't want you to talk about the temple in Jerusalem, because that's never going to happen again. That was the old story. Our temples are right here in America. And people who have that, who subscribe to that philosophy, unfortunately are clearly mistaken and making the same mistake that was made over and over again in our history. We have to remember that the goal is not America. We can be great American citizens. We can participate in this wonderful, wonderful country, which arguably is probably the best country the Jewish people have ever lived in outside of the land of Israel. But nevertheless, we have to remember this is a temporary place. The goal is to return back to the land of Israel in the time of the Mashiach. And Jewish people who forget that, that gives a lot of troubles to begin. So this king, as it says in Genesis, in Shemot, forgot about Joseph, because the Jewish people, I'm going to suggest to you, forgot the message of Joseph. This is not our final place. And then, of course, the king starts reaching out to his nation and asking them when he recognizes if there's a war, they're going to join the other side, the old claim of dual loyalty, which is not the first time in history we've been accused of that, and it wouldn't be the last time. And then, of course, Paro comes up with an idea, and the idea is going to be that he's going to enslave this nation, because if they're enslaved, they're not going to have the energy, they're going to be exhausted, and they're not going to give birth to children. And of course, we see very clearly what happened. Despite the enslavement, despite all that, as it says in verse number 12, as they afflicted them, this is how they increased. This is how they became more. And so the Egyptians became disgusted with Bnei Israel because they became so numerous. And then they were, of course, enslaved in very, very difficult ways. They made their lives bitter, as we continue on to say. Now we're introduced to something very interesting. People like to claim, make all kinds of claims that the rabbis are misogynist and the Torah doesn't talk about women, it only talks about men. But anybody who studies truly sees that that is not the case, okay? Because we said in the beginning of the class, in Masechet Sotah, it says, Bizchut nashim tzadkaniot nig'alu. In the merit of righteous women, we were redeemed. That's what it says in the Talmud. But what was the righteousness of the women? We're not going to say it's the foremothers, because that's included in the forefathers and the foremothers. Their merit is why we were redeemed. But there has to be something about the generation that was living in Egypt that was worthy to be redeemed. And we notice very clearly it doesn't say very much about the men. And we see in chapter 1, verse number 15, very interesting. What does it say? Vayomer melech Mitzrayim lamiyaladot ha'ivriot asher shem ha'achat shifra v'shem ha'shenit pu'ah. And the king of Egypt recognized that despite the fact that he was enslaving the Jewish nation, they were continuing to multiply, they were continuing to have many, many children, so he realized that that wasn't going to work. So instead, what did he do? He went to the midwives. He went to the midwives, the miyaladot, the ladies who helped children to give birth. And the Torah then gives their names. Now, of course, these are not their real names. Their real names are Yocheved and Miriam. According to another opinion, they're Yocheved and Elisheva. The Elisheva, of course, being the wife of Aharon later on. But nevertheless, we see that the Torah is telling us about the women. It hasn't mentioned anything about any men. The only men that were mentioned so far were the brothers, which are the same ones that were mentioned in the end of Genesis. The new introduction that we see here, of course, is talking about Paro talking to the midwives. And it gives their names, also something uncharacteristic of the Torah. Generally, the Torah will speak about ladies, but not necessarily give their names. Here it specifically says their names, and these are not even their names, these are actually their actions, which we'll talk about shortly. And Paro then tells them, of course, that when you give birth to the children, when they're going to come out, when their women are giving birth, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, then you should let it live. And this is Paro's solution to the Jewish problem. He figured he would recruit the midwives because they would have fear of the king of Egypt and they would follow his command. Well, that was his mistake. As we see in the next pasuk, Vatirena hamiyaladot et ha'elohim, that these midwives were fearful of God more than they were fearful of the king of Egypt. V'lo asu, and they did not follow the king's command, Kashi diber alehem melech Mitzrayim, like the king spoke to them. And then it adds something, Vatichayena et hayeladim. Not only did they not kill the boys that were born alive, but even children that were born, stillborn, they would make sure to do what they could to keep them alive, to bring them back. And that's one of the opinions of what it means, shifra. What is shifra? There's a word in Hebrew called shefoferet, which is a reed. And a reed, what would they do? When the baby came out of its mother, and God forbid if it wasn't breathing, shifra would then take a reed and she would put it in the baby's mouth into the throat, and then pu'ah would breathe into the reed. We have the beginning of what we call nowadays mechanical ventilation, something that was invented by medical science about 60 years ago, but we see this is precisely what they were doing. So not only did they not kill the boys, but when children were born in a difficult situation, they would revive them. Now, if you think about it, that's an extra level. If there were some children that were born stillborn, they could say, you know what? Paro, some of them, they're dying. You see, we're doing your commandment. But they wanted to show that they were not following Paro's commandment at all. They were following God's commandment, and therefore they did not only did they not kill the children, but they had them make sure that they lived. And Paro very quickly saw that the mortality rate amongst Jewish children was low, certainly compared to the Egyptians, because the Egyptians perhaps didn't have the skills to revive these children. So if the mortality rate was 10% amongst Egyptian children, the mortality rate amongst the Jewish children was almost zero. So therefore, Paro recognized not only did they not follow his advice, but they did the exact opposite. Now comes the confrontation. These ladies know that sooner or later Paro is going to figure it out, and the bottom line is they didn't care. And it says over here, Vayikra Melech Mitzrayim Lamayaladot. The king called these midwives, and he said, "Why haven't you followed? Why didn't you do what I asked you to do?" And then he adds, "And not only did you not kill them, but what you did is you caused them to continue to be alive. You caused them to be revived. Why didn't you follow my commandment?" And the midwife said, Lo chanashim hamitzriot ha'ivriot. The Egyptian women, the Jewish women are not like the Egyptian women. Ki chayotena. One way you could look at that was very alive. It requires, in order for them to kill the child, it requires the mother not to be alert and awake, so she doesn't realize that they're killing the child, and that's why it's born dead. But the Jewish women were born, when they gave birth, they were strong, they were awake, they could see what was going on. The also word chaya in Hebrew is a midwife. It's another name for a midwife. Despite the fact that the Torah says mialedet, the word chaya also means a midwife. So not only was Shifra and Pu'ah, they were the head of the midwives. But if you can imagine, if there were 6 babies born with every pregnancy, 2 women would have a very challenging time to be able to deliver all those babies themselves. So what happens is Shifra and Puah were the head of this midwifery school, but all the Jewish women participated in giving birth to the children. And that's why it says that they were chayot, meaning what? That they were also midwives. And since they were in the business, they understood when the child came out what it's supposed to look like and all those kind of things. And therefore that was the reason they gave why they could not fulfill the commandment of Paro. Next pasuk. Vayetev Elohim lamayaladot. And God gave benefit to these midwives. Vayirev ha'am vayatzmu me'od. And the nation continued to become greater and greater in numbers. Next pasuk, I'm in chapter 1, verse number 21. Vayhi ki yaru hamiyaledot et Elohim vayas lahem batim. And it was that because the midwives had fear of God, not fear of Paro, but fear of God, he made for them houses. Batim in Hebrew means houses. What does that mean, he made them houses? So if you think about it, when people get married, very commonly, they'll come over to the young couple and they'll say, "May you be zoche to build a bayit ne'eman beYisrael." Translated, may you have the merit to build a trustworthy house in the Jewish nation. Now, of course, newly married people may not know what that means. They got to figure it out relatively quickly. What does it mean to have a trustworthy house? What does that mean? So first of all, the husband has to trust the wife. When he's out to work, he has to trust that she is not behaving improperly. The wife has to trust the husband. When he's on a business trip or he's away at work, she has to trust that he's not behaving inappropriately. They have to trust each other. They have to trust God, that God is going to help them in life, and then God has to trust them. So what that means is a Beit Ne'eman B'Yisrael is a trustworthy home where the husband trusts the wife trusts the husband, each one of them trusts God, and God can trust them so that when he sends a holy Jewish soul to be born, that they're going to raise that child in a proper way according to the ways of God and the ways of the Torah. So what does it mean, a Beit Ne'eman? A trustworthy home. So what did God do for these 2 ladies? He gave them a home. Meaning what? If you look at Rashi, Yocheved, who is the mother of Aharon and Moshe, Aharon, of course, being the Kohen, and Moshe being a Levi, so Yocheved became the mother of the house of the Kohanim, because she was the mother of Aharon, and she also became the mother of the house of Levi, because Moshe Rabbeinu was Levi. And Miriam, who was the other child of these two, of Yocheved and Amram, Miriam became the mother of the king. Meaning what? If we understand that Miriam married Kalev ben Yefuneh. Kalev ben Yefuneh was a descendant of Yehuda, and from Kalev comes David HaMelech. So we understand that Miriam was the matriarch of the Davidic lineage. Once again, we see that this reward they received for the fact that they had proper fear of God and they did not forget the goal. The goal was for them to have many, many children so they can leave Egypt. And let's just talk about that for one moment so we begin to understand why they had to go into the exile and why we're in the exile. Of course, they went into the exile because they sold their brother as a slave. We're in the exile now because we didn't behave properly and the temple was destroyed. We weren't nice to each other. We didn't treat each other with proper respect. We hated each other for no good reason. And that's why the temple was destroyed. But the Talmud teaches us there's another reason we go into the Galut. The other reason we go into the Galut is to gather converts. Now that's very interesting because generally as a religion we don't proselytize. We're not the Hare Krishnas that go stand out on Madison Avenue and tell everybody to become Jewish. We don't do that. We proselytize internally. We make sure that Jews who are born that way stay Jewish, but we don't go out and try to convert Gentiles to become Jews. Unlike many other religions, take evangelical Christians. Their mission in life is to convert people into Christianity, because that is the way they recognize it's the truth and they have to convert these people. And the reason for that is very simple, because according to their belief system, anyone who doesn't believe in Jesus is destined to be in hell for all eternity. As Jews, we don't have a belief like that. Gentiles also have a portion in the world to come, just like Jews do. So we don't have to go out and proselytize to the Gentiles. If a person was born a Gentile, we just want them to live their life according to the Torah as this pertaining to Gentiles and was commanded to Noah in the 8th or the 9th chapter of Genesis. But that's another class for another day. If a Gentile wants to become Jewish, we dissuade them initially, but if they persist, then we convert them. It's a long process, it's an arduous process, because we want to make sure that this person, once they accept upon themselves all the laws of the Torah, that we don't make their situation worse. Because to go from 7 laws to 613, it's a lot more opportunities to get close to God, but it's also a lot more opportunities to get further from God. So we want to make sure of the sincerity of the person. So we're not interested in finding people that are insincere. We want sincere people. But part of our goal in going out into the exile is to find these souls, find these people who want to join our nation and assist them in the path to becoming part of the Jewish nation. So therefore, we don't proselytize. We actually discourage it. But if they persist, we allow them to come on. The goal, of course, is to extract all of the holiness out of the exile. We have a commandment in the Torah that tells us that there's one place in the world we're not allowed to live. And that's Egypt. It says, again, there's different opinions of what that means. It says, you shall not go back to Egypt this way. So some people want to say, as long as you don't go the way we left, you're allowed to go back. But the Rambam, who lived in Egypt at the end of his life, because of a catastrophe that happened with his brother, who was very wealthy, but he drowned and lost all of his possessions, and Rambam had to go live in Egypt. He writes, I am Moses ben Maimon, the Sfaradi, who is sinning every single day living in the land of Egypt. So we understand that there are many people who held that to this day that living in the land of Egypt is not allowed. Why not? How come we're allowed to live in Indonesia and Australia and America? We're even allowed to live in Germany, although I'm not sure why anybody would want to do that. We're allowed to live in these places, but in Egypt we're not allowed to live. And that's because when the Jewish people left Egypt, they extracted all of the holiness out of Egypt. As it says, when they left, all of the armies of God left Egypt. Nobody was left behind, and they extracted all of the holiness out of Egypt. So therefore, there is no purpose to be in Egypt. The purpose to being in the exile is to extract the holiness that's there. Since all of the holiness had been extracted by the people in the time of the Exodus, therefore, there was no reason for a Jew ever to go back there. So we understand that our goal in going out into the world, into all the places of the world, is to extract the holiness, and gather it together to come together in the time of the Mashiach to the land of Israel in the final redemption. So there's no reason to live in Egypt. And therefore, what allowed this to happen? The fact that so many children were born. All of these children were what allowed the Jewish people to extract that holiness out of Egypt. So the mission of these midwives wasn't just they weren't following Paro's decree, but they were helping to bring about the redemption. Because the more children that were born, the more people they were to extract the holiness. Once that is done, that is time to leave. And that's why it's so important for Jewish families to do their best they can to have as many children as is possible, so that we can extract the holiness from wherever we are and bring the redemption sooner. These are these women, specifically Shifra and Puah, but it wasn't just them. It was all the women participating together as midwives. There are many midrashim that talk about when Paro made all kinds of decrees against the Jewish people, the women they would go out into the fields, their husbands were exhausted, they didn't want to have any relations because they were just overworked. They would go out into the fields, they with the mirrors, they would dress themselves up, and they would go with fish. This way it would allow them to have many children. And the women would work to make sure that the husbands weren't so exhausted that they couldn't bring children into the world. That was the goal, is to have as many children as possible to allow the redemption to happen. And then, of course, Paro makes a decree, as we see at the end of chapter 1, in verse number 22. Vayitzav Paro lechol amo lemor kol haben hayilod hayorot tashlichu v'chol habat techayun. And Paro commanded all of his nation that all of the boys that are born should be thrown into the river, and all of the girls should be allowed to live. And the reason for that is Paro, the astronomers, or whatever you want to call them, in Egypt, Egypt was a place of magic, and they basically told them that the one who's going to take the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt is going to be born this year. So Paro decreed that all the boys should be killed. So this way, whoever is going to be the one who's going to take the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt, with, of course, God's instruction, that boy would be killed. Paro was trying to respond to that, and therefore he was commanding that all of the boys be killed. Next pasuk, which is the beginning of chapter 2, tells us, Vayelech ish mi bet Levi vayikach et bat Levi. A man from the house of Levi, we know this is Amram, the father of Moshe Rabbeinu, went and took a girl from the house of Levi. Now, this is a very interesting pasuk, because in fact he was married to Yocheved before. He remarried her. And the Gemara tells us in Masechet Sotah that when Paro made the decree against the Jewish men, against the boys, that they would have to be thrown into the river, Amram separated from his wife Yocheved, because he said to himself, why am I going to bring children into the world that Paro is just going to throw into the river and kill? So therefore, Amram separated from Yocheved. Amram, being the leader of the Jewish nation, when he did that, all of the Jewish people separated from their wives, and therefore this decree would be canceled. But there was one little fly in the ointment. Her name was Miriam. Aaron was already born over here. So Miriam was 3 years older than Aharon, and Aharon was 3 years older than Moshe Rabbeinu. So you can imagine Miriam had to be between the ages of 4 and say 5 years old. And Miriam already at this point is a prophet. And she receives a prophecy, and the prophecy she receives is just like the astronomers of Egypt told Paro that the Moshiach, the one who's going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, is going to be born this year. She was given a prophecy exactly the same thing. But there's a problem. Her father separated from his wife, and the men did the same thing. So she went to her father, it says in Masechet Sotah, and she says, Daddy, your decree is worse than that of Paro, because his decree is only against the boys, and your decree is against the boys and the girls. When Amram heard the wisdom of his young daughter, and Amram, we have to recognize, is one of the 4 people the Gemara tells us had no sin, that he was without sin. So Amram went and he remarried Yocheved. And when he remarried Yocheved, it says Vayikach, and the Ramban discusses this and says, this is usually a language that's referred to when a person first marries a person. When, of course, we know there's a mitzvah in the Torah that if a man, God forbid, divorces his wife, obviously if he divorced her not because she did anything improper and things like that, that there's a mitzvah from the Torah that he should remarry her. It's called mahazir et girushato, to return the one he divorced back. As long as she doesn't marry another man, the entire time he has a mitzvah, he has a commandment to remarry her. So what happens here is that he remarries Yocheved. But that's called a machazir. That's not vayelech, vayikach. That language is the language of a new marriage. So what it says, the Ramban says, that Amram, he made such a happy occasion for the fact that he remarried his wife, that it felt as if he married her the first time. And of course, the only people participating in this wedding were Aharon and Miriam, because all the other people had to go and do their work. So Aharon and Miriam, and it says that Amram made a canopy and carried his wife to the chuppah. Beautiful story, but we see from here that that's why it says, the Ramban says, it uses the language of Vayikach. But that was based on the advice of Miriam. Once again, we see the first chapter discussing the greatness of Yocheved and Miriam, and specifically all the women that were mialdot, that were the midwives. And now we see over here in this parasha already, as we see it's a little subtle here, Miriam being the major factor here, and he remarries, and Miriam tells her father, and he remarries. Vatahar Aisha vateled ben, and of course we know that a boy was born. Vatere oto ki tovhu, and they saw that he was good. Rashi says they saw that he was born with a Brit Milah, that he was already had a certain level, that he was a special boy. Nevertheless, there's a problem. There's a decree against any boy that is born. So Yocheved was able to hide Moshe Rabbeinu for 3 months. And the reason for that is because Moshe Rabbeinu was born 3 months premature. He was born in the 6th month of pregnancy. The Egyptians would go around, they would find out whoever was pregnant, they would know their estimated date of confinement, their EDC, that's what we call it today, and then they would come searching in the house when it was 9.5 months to find the baby, and if it was a boy, then they would throw it into the river. So Yocheved, since she gave birth 3 months early, she was able to hide Moshe Rabbeinu for those 3 months. But then it says, what happened? V'lo yachila od hatzafino. She could no longer hide him because now it was becoming to the point where the Egyptians were going to start to look. And what did she do? It's very interesting. Where's Amram? It doesn't say anything here what Amram did. Vatikach lo tevat gomer. She took an ark and she made an ark, and she put around all kinds of ways to keep the water out of it, and she put the child into the bassinet, or whatever you want to call it, the ark, the teva, and she put it in the suf, and she put it on the river al sfat hayor, on the river. So we see this is Yocheved. This is Amram's nowhere to be found. Yocheved is the one, and she's putting this baby onto the river. And we see then, of course, his sister in the next pasuk, v'titatzav achalto merachok, that his sister watched to know what would happen to the young child. So once again, we see the activity of the women, specifically Yocheved and Miriam, making sure that the one who's going to bring the Jewish people out of Egypt is going to be okay. And then, of course, we see another woman. Vateret bat Paro l'rchos al hayor. The daughter of Paro comes to wash herself on the Nile River. The na'arotea l'chot al yad hayor, and her assistants are there as well. Vateret teva betoch hasuf, and she saw the teva, she saw the ark that was in the reeds. Suf means reeds. Vatishlachet amata v'tikacheh, and she sent out her maidservant to go and bring this ark in. And of course, what happens? She opens up the ark, and what does she see? She sees a baby crying, and she had mercy on the baby, and she recognized that this was a Jewish child. And what does she do? She basically wants to keep the child, which is very interesting given that her father made the decree. So the Ramban asked this question: how could it be that if this is a Jewish child, that she was allowed to keep the child if Paro wanted all the boys to be killed? And he says very clearly, once Yocheved put Moshe into the river on the boat, the astronomers of Egypt said, okay, that's it. The Moshiach, the one who's going to save the Jewish people from Egypt, he is already in the water. So Paro canceled the decree. He didn't realize that the very child that was put in the water is the one that's going to, with God's help, take the Jewish people out of Egypt. Next, Miriam is there, and she's got a problem. The problem is that Moshe Rabbeinu refused to nurse from any of the Egyptian women. In the olden days, if a woman was unable to nurse, there were women who had just been pregnant, and there was called a wet nurse. And there was no formula, there was no Enfamil. So what would happen is women would basically be rented, or they would be paid in order to nurse the child. And since Batya, the daughter of Paro, had not been pregnant, there was no way she could nurse Moshe Rabbeinu. So she went around asking the Egyptian women, but Moshe refused to be nursed from these women. He would only, and Miriam of course knew that, and she went to Batya and she said to her, I have a woman that can nurse this child, and of course that woman was Yocheved. And Yocheved nursed Moshe Rabbeinu for 2 years. And this is discussed amongst the Chachamim. There's a concept of Chalav Yisrael, which I'm not going to go into detail about that right now. Ideally, a person should have milk that is prepared by a Jew and not by a Gentile, but that's a whole other discussion right now. Of course, the situation in Moshe Rabbeinu, the mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu was going to speak the Torah. The mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu that was going to speak, as the Torah says, peh, mouth to mouth with God. He's going to have that relationship with God in the future. There is no way that this mouth could be suckling from the breast of a woman that's eating things that are trefot, that are eating things that are not kosher. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu was willing to die rather than be nursed by any of the Gentile women. And that's why Yocheved, she comes in once again, and she is now nursing Moshe Rabbeinu for those 2 years so Moshe can live. And continuing on, you see over here in chapter 2, verse number 10, once we see here, it says, Vayigdal hayeled, and the child grew up. Of course, this is talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. We don't know his name is Moshe over here because his name, according to the Talmud, he had 7 different names. But Tov, when it says Vatera ki Tovhu, according to that, one of his names was Tuvia, which means the name Moshe was not given to him by Yocheved. The name Moshe, as we see, was given to him by Bitya. As it says over here, Vatikra Shmo Moshe, she, mean Batya, called Moshe Rabbeinu by the name Moshe, Ki min hamayim meshitihu, because from the water I took him. And this is the name that stuck with Moshe Rabbeinu his whole life. Despite the fact that the Talmud had 6 other names that Moshe Rabbeinu had, the name Moshe is what is given. We can contrast that a little bit to Yosef. Yosef, he was given the name Yosef by his mother, and nevertheless, when he goes to Egypt, Paro gives him the name Tzafanat Paneach. And Yosef is never called Tzafanat Paneach. He always refers to himself as Yosef. But the Torah with Moshe Rabbeinu is always referring to his Moshe and not referring to him as Tuvia. Why is that? To show the concept of Hakarat HaTov, appreciation, to recognize the good that people do for us. People who cannot recognize good will never be able to see God, because the ultimate good that exists in the world comes from God. And if a person doesn't know how to find the good and appreciate the good, they will never be able to find God. So the Torah is telling us from the beginning, despite the fact that this is not his name was something else, his mother gave him a different name. Nevertheless, this name that was given to him by the daughter of Paro is the name that he's referred to throughout the rest of the Torah. And the reason for that is to show the recognition and the appreciation for what Bitya, the daughter of Paro, did to save Moshe Rabbeinu's life in this circumstance here. Continuing on, so Moshe Rabbeinu says grew up, meaning what? That he no longer needed to be nursed, and he was brought back to the house of Paro, because Moshe Rabbeinu was not going to grow up with Yocheved and Miriam. Bitya was going to raise him up. And that's really that's the beginning of Sefer Shemot. And we see a very, very clear picture. When it says Nashim Tzadkaniot, righteous women, look at what has been told to us in these 2 chapters in the beginning of Shemot. There's almost no mention of the men. We don't even get to Moshe Rabbeinu until this chapter 2, verse number 11, and then it begins to tell us about Moshe Rabbeinu's life. But the first entire chapter and the next 10 verses in the chapter 2, all they're discussing there is the greatness of the women. And that is very, very important. And what made these women so great? The fact that they did not lose sight of the end game. The end game meaning that they were going to come out of the land of Egypt, and they're going to be rescued and be brought back to the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And that's why I'm going to suggest it's very, very important, because like we said in the beginning of the class, that the patterns that we see in the Exodus from Egypt are the same patterns that we're going to see in the Exodus, in the final redemption, in the coming of the Mashiach. And that's why the Arizal, when the Gemara over there, Masechet Sotah, says, in the merit of righteous women we were redeemed, the Arizal then says, in the merit of righteous women we were redeemed, and in the merit of righteous women we will be redeemed in the future. And part of the reason for that is because the generation that comes right before the Mashiach, according to the Ari, are going to be a reincarnation of all the people that were in the generation that left Egypt the first time. So the one that's coming right before the Mashiach is these people. And we have to make up for the mistakes that were done before. Or we have to continue the good things we did before. And that's why it's so essential, men and women, but especially the women, have a clear recognition that this is not the place to be. America is a wonderful country where you can participate here as much as possible, but this is not the end game. When the Mashiach comes, this is not where we're going to be living. We're all going to be living in the land of Israel. And this emunah, this faith, this trust in the redemption, this is so important for us to maintain, and especially amongst the ladies, because we learn Moshe Rabbeinu from the beginning has a tremendous amount of emunah, as we're going to see right here. It says, Vayhi bayamim ahem, when it was in those very days, Vayigdal Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu grew up. Now, how old was Moshe Rabbeinu over here? According to our rabbis, he was 12 years old. And when he became 12 years old, Batya, or Bitya, depending on how you call her name, she told Moshe Rabbeinu the truth. She said to him, by the way, you are a Jewish child. You are not an Egyptian. As soon as Moshe Rabbeinu hears this, which is what's discussed right here, what does he do? It says, Vayetze elechav. He went out to his brothers. Vayar besivlotam. And he saw their suffering, which we see right away. A young boy, 12 years old, who spent 2 years nursing with his mother, and the next 10 years living in the house of Paro. As soon as he hears that he is a Jew, that he is a member of this nation of slaves, he goes out to see what's going on with his brothers. And he sees Vayar ish mitzri makeh ish ivri me'echav. And he sees an Egyptian hitting a Jewish slave. Next pasuk, Vayifen kovacho. He looked to the right, he looked to the left. Vayar kien ish, and he saw that there was no one there. Vayachet hamitzri, and he hit the Egyptian. Vayitmeneu b'chol, and he buried him in the sand. So we see right away Moshe Rabbeinu is going to defend the Jewish people, even at great personal risk. Well, where did he learn that from? He learned that from his mother. Yocheved was willing to submit herself to great personal risk in order not to fulfill the decree of Paro. Moshe Rabbeinu learned that from his mother. But of course we have to ask ourselves, when did he learn it from his mother? While she was nursing him. During those 2 years when she was nursing him, she transmitted that level of emunah, that faith, that tremendous faith in the coming of the redemption to Moshe during those 2 years. And as soon as he finds out that he's Jewish, he recognizes his place is to go and see what's going on with his brothers. He doesn't know that he's going to be the leader of the Jewish nation. He just wants to go see what's going on. And then, of course, he kills the Egyptian, as we see. Now, you would think to yourself, okay, you know what, Moshe Rabbeinu, you went out the first day, you heard about that, you know what, lay low for a couple of weeks and see what happens. Absolutely not. As the next pasuk says in verse number 13, Vayetze bayom hasheni. On the next day, he went out again, which means he got into trouble the first day, he killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand, and now he's going out the next day, because once again, he cannot rest knowing that his fellow Jews are suffering to that level. And then it says, what he sees the second day was even more concerning when he saw the first day. V'nei shnei anashim ivrim nitzim. He saw two Jews fighting with each other, two Jews having a disagreement. We know, according to our rabbis, this is Datan and Aviram, these two troublemakers that existed throughout the entire Torah until they were killed in the time of Korach. These two individuals were the ones who were fighting here. Vayomer l'rasha lama takerecha. And Moshe Rabbeinu says to the evil one, why are you about to hit your friend? And our rabbis learned something very important from here. As soon as one Jew lifts a hand to hit another Jew, even if he hasn't hit him yet, he is called Rasha. He's called an evil one, which means this whole concept of conflict between Jews. This is why they ended up in Egypt. Let's go back to Genesis. What do we learn from there? There was a conflict between Yosef and his brothers. What was their solution? Their initial solution was to kill him. Then Reuven said, no, let's not kill him. Let's just put him into the bar. Let's put him into the pit, and he'll die on his own. And then, of course, Reuven was going to come back and take him out later. And Yehuda is the one who comes and says we should sell him as a slave to Egypt. And that's how the whole thing started. So what happens? Moshe Rabbeinu goes out the second day. He's hopeful that he would see something different. And what does he see? The second day he sees worse than the first day. He sees two Jewish people fighting with each other. And then, of course, the one, after Moshe Rabbeinu opened up his mouth, because Moshe Rabbeinu is not the kind of guy that says, I'm my brother's keeper. Moshe Rabbeinu said something, and once again, he's 12 years old. Vayomer misamecha, and one of them said, presumably Datan, the one who said, who made you to the person who's in charge? Who put you in charge? Imagine a 12-year-old. Who put you in charge? Hal horgenu ata omer, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Kasher harakta et Mitzri, like you killed the Egyptian? Vayira Moshe vayomar, and Moshe Rabbeinu was afraid. Achen noda davar. Now let's understand that. Afraid? What was he afraid of? He killed the Egyptian the day before, and then he goes out the second day. He's like his mother. He's not afraid of Paro. What does it mean, Vayira Moshe vayomar? He recognized something. He recognized that the Jewish people were not ready to be redeemed. They hadn't yet learned that other lesson they're supposed to learn from the incident with Yosef and the brothers, that they have to love each other, they have to be with each other, they have to be friendly with each other. Moshe Rabbeinu recognized it is not time for the redemption now, and what does he do? He runs away, and he goes to Midian. And how long is he gone? He leaves at 12, and he comes back when he is 80 years old, which means the redemption of the Jewish people was delayed 68 years. Why? Because of fighting amongst Jew one to another. And we understand how dangerous this is. And this is what it means, achen noda hadavar. Now I know. I know that they're not ready to be redeemed yet. And now, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu has to leave. And he goes away, and then he comes back afterwards. So once again, we see the story that's told over here. Moshe Rabbeinu is who he is because of his mother, because of his sister. He's alive because of them. The men, the many children that are born are because of these women. So we see Nashim Tzadkaniot, righteous women. So how important it is for our ladies, men too, but I want to speak to the ladies. How important it is for the ladies, based on what the Arizal said, to remember those two things. Number one, to make sure that we avoid any type of conflicts one to another. We don't add to conflicts between two people. We try to mitigate or remove conflicts from people, especially between Jewish people. But the other thing is we always remember the redemption is about to come and not lose sight of the end game. The end game is not America and Spain and Germany and Poland and Uzbekistan. The end game is to go back to the land of Israel in the time of the redemption, to remember what Joseph said. Bring up my bones. And if anybody remembers in chapter 37 of Yechezkel, over there it talks about the dry bones coming together. Yechezkel goes into a field and he sees all these dry bones scattered around. And God says to them, can these dry bones come alive? And Yechezkel says, if that is your will, God, of course they can be alive. And right in front of his face, he has this vision that these bones coming together and they're all coming alive together. And some people say that's actually a prophecy for the resurrection. Could be, but really what is it? It's the concept of the Jewish people in the exile, their bones. You think they're all gone, they're finished. They're not. They will come alive again. V'shavu banim ligvulam. And there's a certain prayer that we say every single day that many people don't know about, unfortunately. And unfortunately, even especially many women don't know about the prayer either. It's called Tikkun Chatzot, which means in the middle of the night, not midnight, because that has nothing to do. It's basically the middle hours of the night. So if you calculate when is sunrise and when is sunset, how many hours there are in the day, and then you take the halfway mark between those, and you add 12 hours to it, that is Chatzot of the night. Just like you have Chatzot of the day, you have Chatzot at the night. And that midnight time, anytime from that point up until dawn, there's a prayer to say where we mourn about the destruction of the temple. And there's discussion amongst the rabbis, should women say the prayer? The Ben Ish Chai says, no, they should not say it. But Chacham Avad Yosef And the poskim today say, yes, they should say it. And this is a prayer that is mourning the destruction of the temple. Meaning what? We know that a person who mourns the destruction of the temple will be zocher, be meritorious to be able to see its building. You have to appreciate in its destruction to recognize what you're missing so that you'd appreciate when it's going to be built. And this prayer is designed so that we would experience that mourning, except on Shabbat and Yom Tov, we experience that mourning when in the middle of the night, when it's a time for prayer, it's a time for opening up of prayer. As we see later on, Vahi b'chatzi alayla, that's when the Makat Bechorot happened. And interesting enough, if you look in the Sidur, there's two pieces to this prayer. One is called Tikkun Le'ah, and one is called Tikkun Rachel. I'm not going to go into the reasons why it's called that, but let's understand that. There are two matriarchs that we know were crying. Le'ah, it says, Ve'ene Le'ah Rakot. Leah was crying. Why was Leah crying? Leah was crying because everybody was saying the oldest one, Leah, with the oldest son of Yitzchak, which is Esav, and the youngest daughter of Lavan, who's Rachel, with the youngest son of Yitzchak, which is Yaakov. And Leah was crying that she should not be married to Esav. And so what happened? We know the story, we read about it a couple of weeks ago, that there was that switcheroo that Lavan did, and Leah actually got married to Yaakov as well. So that crying had an impact. But we also know Rachel. There's a pasuk of the Tanakh that says, Rachel mevaka al banea. Rachel is crying for her children. And then God says from the Shamayim, Min'i kolech mi bechi. Stop crying, Rachel. I heard your prayer. V'shavu banim ligvulam. These two aspects. Number one, protecting us from intermarriage, protecting us from getting into marriages, situations with Esav, and to assimilate. That's number one. And number two, to recognize from Rachel the future redemption that is coming. Rachel, stop crying. The Banim are going to return back to their land. And that's why it's so important for all of us, men and women, to say Tikkun Chatzot and to mourn the destruction of the temple and beg Hashem to bring it back. And with one other thing I want to conclude. Over and over again, our pasuk tells us, Pakod yivkod Elohim etchem. You will surely be redeemed. This was the formula that was given. Yaakov told Yosef, and it was passed down through the elders, that when someone's going to come to you in the future and going to use the term Pakod yivkod, he's going to use that double lashon, that you will surely be redeemed. That's how you know that that person is the Redeemer. No miracles are needed. All you need to know is he's going to use that phrase and he's going to be the Redeemer. So of course, people ask, what's the big deal? Anybody could be taught that. But remember, Moshe Rabbeinu was not with his father Amram. He was with his mother for those 2 years. Then he grew up in the house of Paro, and then at 12 years old, he has to run away till he's 80. So there was no way that Moshe Rabbeinu could have learned this term. So when Moshe Rabbeinu comes back after the sneh, after he sees the burning bush, and he tells the elders, Pakod yivkod Elohim etchem, God is surely going to redeem you. This is how they knew that he was the Moshiach. This is how they knew that he was the one who was going to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, even in absence of miracles. The miracles that he did were not for the elders. The miracles he did were for the common people. The elders did need miracles. Now, what about the future redemption? So just like we have Pakod Yivkod, we have that language of to pay, Pakod Yivkod. We have another Lashon, we have another language, and this is from a verse also in Exodus, in chapter 22, verse number 22. Over there it's discussing a widow and an orphan. And there it says over there that generally we have to be nice to people. That is the expectation of the Torah. But how much more you have to be nice and be careful with the widow and the orphan or the convert. And the reason for that is those three people don't have defenders. The widow has no husband to defend her, the orphan has no parents to defend, and the convert has nobody to defend them. So it says over here, look, it says, if you're going, God forbid, going to cause affliction to the widow or the orphan, ki im tsaok yitzak elai, he will surely or she will surely cry out to me, Shamoa eshma tzakato, I will surely hear his cry. And the next pasuk says, V'chara api, and my anger will be kindled, God says, Veharagti etchem becharev, and I will kill them with a sword. Ve'ayu neshechem almanot, and your wives will be widows, and the sons will be orphans. Very, very strong punishment. How careful you have to be with everyone, especially with the widows and orphans. And the Talmud teaches us that if a person sees another individual giving a difficult time to a widow and orphan, you must step up and say something. If you don't, then it's considered as if you were giving that widow and orphan a difficult time, and God forbid this punishment should be rained on you. We don't want that. But if we look at the pasuk, it's very interesting. Aneh ta'aneh otot, to ayin, double lashon once again. If you surely make him suffer, ki'im tza'ok itz'ak, the same tzadi, two tzadi next to each other, shamoa eshma, I will surely hear. And I want to connect this to what we said before. Yerushalayim is called an almanah. She's called a widow. As we see in the beginning of Lamentations, Echa yashiva badad ha'ira batiyam hayta ka'almanah. We see Yerushalayim is likened to the almanah. Why? Because her husband, God, is distanced from her. Why? Because of the sins of the Jewish people. We have to beg that that city, the city of Jerusalem, or the land of Israel, which right now it doesn't have that level of divine presence like it did in the time of the temple, that we have to recognize that that connection is not as strong as it could be because of our deeds. And we have to recognize that that is a level of suffering for the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah suffers when the Jewish people are out in the exile. And we should not increase the suffering of the Shekhinah. We should pray that the Shekhinah should be able to return back to her husband, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They should be connected together, and that would bring the redemption. Be'ezrat Hashem, b'mihra b'yameinu, amen. Does anybody have any questions? Any questions? Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Beautiful shiur.
You're very, very welcome.
Dr. Grossman.
You're very, very welcome. As God willing, I'm going to post this, and I'll send you a link if you want to watch it or share it with somebody else. Thank you so much for participating, and we'll see you next week, God willing. Okay?
Every Sunday.
Every Sunday, 8 o'clock, Bezrat Hashem. Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.